Washington would prefer to conceal the true cost of its ultimatums, but the numbers speak for themselves. April 12th, 2026. 21 hours of grueling negotiations in Islamabad end in failure. That same day, Viktor Orban loses the election resoundingly. Immediately after J.D. Vance personally flew in to support him, the United States begins hunting down its own allies' commercial fleets. And what does Taiwan have to do with any of this? Thus ends the era of Pax Americana. How did one chain of decisions bring down the old world order? This is the anatomy of ultimatum politics, where an attempt to monetize chaos brings the entire global economy to the brink of collapse. Let's begin with that conference room in Islamabad. The stakes: nothing less than the future of global energy transit. What did Washington want? Complete Iranian capitulation, dismantling of nuclear facilities, cessation of proxy support in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and free passage through Hormuz forever. What did Tehran want? Sanctions relief, security guarantees, recognition as a regional power. What did either side offer? Ultimatums. Here's what most commentators miss about Islamabad. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a performance of dominance that backfired spectacularly. The American delegation arrived with a list of demands and a deadline. The Iranian delegation arrived with something far more dangerous: a backup plan. Within hours of the collapse, Tehran announced its new toll system: $1 per barrel of oil or up to $2 million per vessel, payable in rial or yuan, not dollars. This isn't about Iran charging transit fees. This is about Iran demonstrating that it can charge transit fees and that China will happily pay them. It's about creating a parallel financial architecture that excludes the United States entirely. The American response: hunt down anyone who pays. President Trump's exact words: nobody who pays the illegal toll will get safe passage in open sea. World extortion must end. Think about what this means. American naval vessels are now authorized to intercept, board, and detain commercial ships, including those belonging to NATO allies, Asian partners, and neutral nations, in international waters. Not because those ships broke American law, not because they threatened American security, but because they paid a fee to pass through waters America doesn't control. Here's where it gets truly absurd. The U.S. Navy is now hunting down commercial tankers belonging to Saudi Arabia, theoretically one of America's closest partners in the region. Washington has transformed from the guarantor of freedom of navigation into its primary threat. As of mid-April, over 600 vessels are trapped in the Gulf. Brent crude has stabilized above $100 per barrel, and the most powerful navy in history has become a pirate fleet hunting its own friends. But there's a deeper irony here that few analysts have noticed. The vaunted American submarine fleet, those giant Ohio-class and Virginia-class nuclear boats, has proven nearly useless in this conflict. These vessels were designed for deep ocean warfare against peer competitors. In the shallow, cluttered waters of the Persian Gulf, they're essentially blind. Meanwhile, Iran's fleet of tiny diesel-electric submarines can simply rest on the seabed, invisible to sonar, turning the entire Gulf into a minefield. The world's most expensive naval technology, defeated by geography and ingenuity. Europe refused to send minesweepers. The United States finds itself alone in a mine-filled sea, its multi-billion-dollar submarines circling uselessly while Iranian speedboats dart through the shallows. This is the Islamabad paradox. The attempt to project overwhelming strength has revealed overwhelming vulnerability. Now, let's talk about money, because ultimately this story is about money and what money can and cannot buy. On April 3, 2026, the Trump administration released its budget proposal for fiscal year 2027. The request for discretionary programs totals $2.2 trillion. The headline number for defense, $1.5 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Of that, $350 billion is being pushed through budget reconciliation, a legislative maneuver that bypasses normal debate and sidelines Democratic opposition entirely. To put this in perspective, the entire Russian federal budget for 2025 was approximately $450 billion. America is proposing to spend more than 3 times that on defense alone. But the real story isn't the spending, it's what's being cut to pay for it. Civilian agencies face reductions of 10 to 20% across the board. Environmental programs gutted, social services slashed. The traditional civilian state is being systematically dismantled to concentrate resources on a coercive foreign policy. And then there's the tariffs, 50% on steel and aluminum. This isn't just market protection, it's preparation. The United States has already become the world's third-largest steel producer. The industrial base is being rebuilt not for peacetime prosperity, but for protracted conflict. Domestic cuts to environmental and social programs are becoming direct sponsors of geopolitical aggression. But here's the question nobody in Washington seems to be asking. What's all this force actually buying? The United States has no peer competitor in conventional military terms. China's navy is growing, yes, but remains primarily a regional force. Russia's military has been systematically degraded in Ukraine. Iran has no air force worth mentioning. So why $1.5 trillion? The answer lies in understanding how Washington now conceives of power. This isn't a defense budget, it's a coercion budget. It's the financial infrastructure for a foreign policy based entirely on ultimatums and on monetizing chaos itself, which brings us to Taiwan. While the world focused on the Hormuz crisis, a different kind of negotiation was unfolding across the Pacific. Taiwan, facing the perpetual threat of Chinese invasion and uncertain about American reliability, made a calculated bet: $250 billion. That's the investment Taipei has committed to American semiconductor production, building chip fabrication plants on U.S. soil, transferring technology, creating jobs. In exchange, a tariff reduction of up to 15% on Taiwanese goods. Think about the structure of this deal. Taiwan isn't paying for protection in the traditional sense. It's not a defense treaty. It's not a security guarantee. It's a transaction. Cash for consideration, investment for tolerance. Taiwan has essentially purchased a 15% discount on American trade barriers by agreeing to build America's chip industry for it. This is what America First looks like in practice. The United States has abandoned its role as the global policeman, the benevolent hegemon that maintained order because order itself was valuable. Instead, it has become what I call a selfish mega player, a nation that views every relationship as a profit center, every alliance as a protection racket, every crisis as an opportunity for extraction. But here's the trap that nobody in Washington seems to see. By abandoning the policeman role, America has created a vacuum that constrains everyone, including itself. Consider China's position. Beijing and Moscow both vetoed the UN resolution that would have affirmed Iran's right to control the Strait of Hormuz. They did this to oppose American influence, to demonstrate that the U.S. couldn't dictate international maritime law. It was a clever diplomatic move at the time. Now the United States itself has closed the strait. American warships are blocking passage, seizing vessels, creating the very obstruction that China and Russia claim to oppose, and China cannot legally condemn it. Having vetoed the resolution affirming free passage, Beijing has no standing to complain when passage is denied. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is suffocating without Gulf oil. 20 million barrels per day. That's the estimated shortfall. China's strategic petroleum reserve can cover perhaps 90 days. After that, factories go dark. This is the paradox of the selfish mega player. By abandoning principles in favor of pure transaction, America has trapped its competitors in their own cynicism. But America is equally trapped. It cannot back down without appearing weak. It cannot escalate without triggering global economic collapse. It cannot negotiate without partners willing to trust its word. Everyone is stuck, and the global economy is paying the price. Now, let's cross the Atlantic because what's happening in Europe is perhaps the most underreported story of 2026. NATO, the most successful military alliance in human history, is dying, not from external attack, but from internal abandonment. President Trump has publicly called the alliance a paper tiger and a disappointment. He's threatened to withdraw the United States entirely. The trigger: European refusal to support military operations against Iran. Let's look at two specific cases that illustrate the collapse. France. When Paris refused to allow American aircraft carrying supplies for Israel to transit French airspace, President Trump launched a sustained social media campaign against Emmanuel Macron. The attacks weren't policy-based. They were personal, mocking incidents during Macron's foreign visits, calling his leadership useless. Spain. When Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez refused to allow American forces to use bases at Rota and Moron for strikes against Iran, the American response was immediate and absolute. Cut off all dealings. Total trade termination threatened against a NATO ally. Trump's exact characterization: Spain has terrible leadership and gives nothing to the U.S. except beautiful people. Sanchez's response was three words that have become the rallying cry of European resistance: no a la guerra, no to war. Here's what American policymakers don't seem to understand. Spain and France aren't opposing the United States out of weakness. They're opposing the United States because they've calculated that the cost of following Washington has exceeded the cost of defying it. That calculation, that simple cost-benefit analysis, is the death certificate of Pax Americana. And Europe isn't just resisting, it's preparing. The Danish model of direct military-industrial financing is being adopted across the EU. Brussels is drafting plans for autonomous defense capabilities, not just against the threat from the East, but against the unpredictability from overseas. For the first time in 70 years, European defense planners are asking, what if America itself becomes the problem? The Orban collapse accelerated this transformation. April 12, 2026, the same day negotiations failed in Islamabad, Viktor Orban had ruled Hungary for 16 years. He'd built what he proudly called an illiberal democracy. He was Trump's closest ideological ally in Europe. The proof: Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Budapest personally just days before the election to endorse him. The result: catastrophic defeat. Peter Magyar's Tisza party won 138 of 199 parliamentary seats, a constitutional supermajority. Orban didn't just lose, he was annihilated. Turnout exceeded 79%. The Hungarian people decided overwhelmingly that the illiberal experiment was over. And here's the darkest irony: Vance's visit may have helped seal Orban's fate. Nothing motivates voters quite like the perception that a foreign power is interfering in their elections. The Vice President of the United States standing beside an unpopular autocrat days before the vote. That's not support. That's a target painted on Orban's back. Orban wasn't just a Hungarian politician. He was a node in a network, proof of concept that you could be an EU member, NATO ally, and Kremlin-friendly all at once. His failure invalidates the theory that right-wing populism is the inevitable future of Western politics. The Budapest model that American conservatives championed is finished. Now, let's talk about Ukraine and the moral abyss at the center of American policy. In Miami, negotiations continue over what's being called the 28-point plan. The details are still emerging, but the broad strokes are clear. Territorial concessions to Russia, abandonment of Ukrainian NATO membership aspirations, and a mechanism for using $100 billion in frozen Russian assets, not to rebuild Ukraine, but as leverage in the deal itself. This is what peace looks like when your mediator has no principles. Washington isn't brokering a settlement. It's forcing capitulation on Kyiv while extracting financial benefit from the process. The frozen Russian assets, money that was seized specifically because of Russian aggression, may end up lubricating a deal that rewards that aggression. I've covered enough conflicts to know that peace often requires painful compromises. But there's a difference between compromise and betrayal. When your allies can no longer distinguish between the two in your policies, you've lost something that no military budget can buy back. Which brings us to the Vatican and the strangest subplot of this entire crisis. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope in history, has publicly criticized what he called the idolatry of self in American leadership. The Vatican, usually cautious in its political statements, has directly condemned the course toward war with Iran. The president's response, he called the Pope very liberal and suggested that without his own return to the White House, an American would never have become pope. But the conflict has escalated beyond words. AI-generated images depicting Trump as Jesus Christ have circulated widely on social media, shared by supporters as expressions of devotion. The Catholic Church has condemned these images as blasphemous, and suddenly a geopolitical conflict has become a theological one. The Catholic electorate in the United States is deeply divided. Traditionalist Catholics who supported Trump on social issues now face a direct confrontation between their president and their pope. Progressive Catholics see confirmation of what they've always suspected, and the broader world watches as America loses its claim to be a defender of Christian values. This is the moral collapse at the heart of transactional politics. When everything is a deal, nothing is sacred. When everyone is a debtor, no one commands respect. When even the Pope is described as owing something to the president, we've entered a realm where the concept of principled opposition has been abolished. America isn't just losing allies, it's losing the moral vocabulary that made alliance possible. Now, let's talk about what ordinary people actually feel: the price of survival. Since the Hormuz blockade began, American gas prices have risen 38%. The national average is approaching $5 per gallon. In some states, it's already passed that threshold. March inflation came in at 3.26%, well above the Federal Reserve's target. And this is before the full effects of the blockade have worked through the system. Europe is facing something potentially worse. A shortage of 20 million barrels per day has created a jet fuel crisis. Just as summer travel season approaches, the Eurozone has already committed 680 billion euros to energy subsidies. That's money that won't go to defense, infrastructure, or social programs. The threat of fuel rationing, something not seen since the 1970s, is now being discussed openly in Brussels. Here's the historical parallel that should terrify policymakers. We may be entering a decade of stagflation. Not recession alone, that would be manageable. Not inflation alone, that could be addressed. But both together, feeding each other, creating a trap from which there is no easy escape. Goldman Sachs now estimates a 30% probability of American recession by year's end. But that estimate was made before the full implications of the blockade became clear. The real probability may be higher, and here's the unobvious consequence that almost no one is discussing. The Hormuz crisis has exposed the absolute fragility of European decarbonization. By rejecting Russian pipeline gas in favor of LNG, Europe made itself totally dependent on secure sea lanes. That dependency was supposed to reduce vulnerability, diversifying away from a single authoritarian supplier. Instead, it created a new vulnerability: dependence on maritime routes that Europe cannot defend. The supreme irony: this security has now been destroyed by the hands of Europe's main ally, not by Russia, not by Iran, by the United States. The American Navy that was supposed to guarantee freedom of navigation has become the force denying it. So where does this leave us? Let me pull everything together into a single picture. What we're witnessing in the first half of 2026 is not a series of disconnected events, it's a cascade. Each decision triggers consequences that constrain the next decision, creating a doom loop of escalation and isolation. Tariffs on steel lead to Allied resentment. Allied resentment reduces cooperation on Iran. Reduced cooperation leads to the Islamabad failure. Islamabad's failure triggers the Hormuz blockade. The blockade creates an energy crisis. The energy crisis drives inflation. Inflation increases recession risk. Recession risk creates political instability in allied nations. Political instability accelerates European autonomy. European autonomy reduces American leverage. Reduced leverage leads to more aggressive unilateralism, and the cycle repeats. The paradox at the center of this spiral is what I call the vulnerability of overwhelming power. The United States has the military capacity to do almost anything, but the exercise of that capacity has costs, diplomatic, economic, moral, that America cannot bear alone. A $1.5 trillion defense budget means nothing if your allies won't host your bases. Naval dominance means nothing if using it crashes your own economy. Nuclear superiority means nothing if the threat of using it isn't credible. The Taiwan deal shows the new reality. Allies don't follow anymore. They negotiate. They pay tribute, $250 billion worth, for temporary consideration. Power, real power, comes from relationships, from trust, from the belief by other nations that cooperation with you serves their interests. When that belief dies, all you have left is coercion, and coercion at global scale is unsustainable. The November midterms are approaching. Republican control of Congress is genuinely threatened by $5 gasoline and rising inflation. The European Union is accelerating plans for autonomous security architecture. China is trapped by its own veto at the UN, watching its economy suffocate while unable to condemn the blockade it implicitly enabled. Russia observes the West tearing itself apart over disputes that have nothing to do with Moscow, and the Vatican has declared American leadership morally bankrupt. I started this analysis by asking how one chain of decisions brought down the old world order. The answer, I think, is simpler than we'd like it to be. The old world order wasn't brought down. It was given away, discarded, treated as a cost rather than an asset, sold off for short-term gains that haven't materialized. What $1.5 trillion can buy you? Aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, missile defense systems, the most advanced military hardware ever created, submarines that are useless in shallow water, tariffs that alienate your allies, a trade war with nations you need. What $1.5 trillion cannot buy you? The belief by other nations that your leadership serves their interests. That's earned over decades through consistent behavior, and it can be destroyed in months. This is the anatomy of impotence. Not weakness, impotence, the possession of great power without the ability to use it productively, the capacity to destroy without the capacity to build, the means to threaten but not to persuade, the wealth to buy transactions but not trust. April 2026 will be remembered as the month when the American century ended, not with a bang, but with an ultimatum that nobody accepted. And the bill for that ultimatum? We're all going to pay it. At the gas pump, in grocery prices, in the jobs that disappear when the recession hits, in the wars that follow. When the old order's constraints are finally gone, this is what happens when a superpower decides that it would rather be feared than trusted. It gets neither. If this analysis helped you understand the shifting global order, subscribe and share. Next week, the second order effects, how the Hormuz crisis reshapes global shipping routes permanently, and why the Suez Canal may never recover its pre-2026 traffic. Until then, watch the oil prices. They'll tell you everything you need to know. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Also, share your comments.